Hey guys, Matt here with episode 37 of the Chocolate Croissants podcast. I hope you are all doing great, and it's good to be here. I've been traveling over the past couple weeks since I got home from tour, and it is really good to be back. I'm excited because next week for episode 38, I will finally be back together with Jordan and Justin. We haven't seen each other in 6 weeks or 7 weeks or something like that since I've been on tour, and they've been traveling and doing their own things as well. So it'll be really, really good to get in the room together and be back in the normal swing to kick off 2018 with a bang, so they say. But until then, this episode is going to be a little bit different, actually a lot different than anything we've ever done before. We're actually using episode 37 as a re-release of podcast number 33, which was the episode with Brandon Bateman. The reason that we are doing this is because we all felt pretty strongly that that episode didn't really get the attention that it deserved, and it's actually our fault. We had recorded a proper intro and proper outro, but somehow, unfortunately, the wrong version got uploaded to all of the apps, and then we realized that pretty quickly, but we realized that a lot of people had already digested it, so we took it down, and then in putting it back up with the proper intro and outro, it just really lost a lot of visibility and a lot of traction, and it just didn't really get the listens that we were hoping that it would get. So with that being said, we had all been trying to figure out the best time to re-release it, and given our schedules and timing and the importance of the content in that episode, we thought that now would be a great time to re-release episode 33 as episode 37 with Brandon Bateman. So for those of you that have listened to that episode, feel free to go back and check out some of our other episodes that you may not have listened to before. But if you missed it, then I would highly encourage you to listen all the way through, because Brandon Bateman is one of the most interesting and one of the smartest people that I've had the privilege to call a friend. So for those that aren't aware, here's some information on Brandon. So Brandon is an Eagle Scout, a Marine Corps veteran, a thinker, writer, speaker, consultant, teacher, musician. He's a badass drummer, by the way. World traveler, tactician, woodworker. He's a maker, a firearms instructor, an executive protection specialist, a behavioral scientist, a lifelong student, and in his words, many, many other things. His operational experience as it relates to the context of this conversation in this episode is as follows. So Brandon served 8 years in the U.S. Marine Corps Infantry, followed by 7 years as a security specialist, close protection officer, and field security advisor with multiple private sector entities and multinational government agencies. He has conducted and led numerous operations in several countries throughout the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He is an expert instructor of Israeli Krav Maga, the guidance system. He is currently a military and law enforcement consultant, as well as an author and an orator on the subject of operational cognition and applied psychology. To connect with Brandon, you can follow him on social media and learn more about him at the following locations. So, thebrandonbateman.com, agapetactical.com, or israelikrav.com. Now, just to sort of give my own take on Brandon and the conversation we had, it was really pretty mind-blowing. And Brandon is a pretty mind-blowing individual to know, as I said, as a friend, and to communicate and talk with him is really special, because he's been through a lot of things that most people, pretty much the majority of people that I know, have not been through. So his perspective on the world is truly unique, and it's been, tested through fire, literally, like gunfire and rocket fire and explosions, and that kind of experience can really shape someone's mindset in a way that is just really special. So that may sound funny to those of you who are in the military or who have been through something similar, but I have not been in those situations. So to me, it's just really inspiring to talk to someone who has had to kind of build the mental strength to get through situations like that, and I have the utmost respect for it. So that's really where I'm coming from with this. But anyway, in this conversation, it's myself, Brandon, and then Jake Bowen from my band Periphery, and we recorded it in Nashville a bunch of weeks back while I was on tour in the back of my tour bus. So you'll hear some noise, and you'll hear like the door opening and some people coming in and out and so forth, but it's pretty minimal. But the thing to really pay attention to here is the actual content and the conversation itself. So we start off by talking about some things that Brandon found important, like bullying, and just treating others with respect. And then from there, we dug into Brandon's history in the military, what sort of formed his opinions on getting into the military, why he stayed there, what he loved about it. We talked a lot about his experience through some of the most influential and some of the most meaningful days of his life. He's seen some shit, so he talks about that pretty candidly here in this conversation. We also dig into Brandon's current work, which is really focused on bringing more attention to the local police officers, the EMTs, the security officers that are in your local cities, and providing them with more support for trauma that they may experience day to day on the job. They see things that most people don't really see, and it absolutely has an effect. And from what I've learned from talking to Brandon, the support systems that are provided by the government really are pretty minimal for these types of people. So it's a very, very important topic that Brandon is very much passionate about, and he's dedicating a lot of his work right now into providing psychological support and advice, and is even lobbying to get more people behind this initiative to just provide support for the people that are putting their lives at risk every day to protect each one of us in our local cities and local streets. So there's a lot here. Post-traumatic stress is a big one, talking about fear, talking about self-doubt, talking about death, talking about life. There's a lot of really deep topics, and a lot of people have actually messaged me directly that have listened to this episode and have said, holy shit, wow, like this was a serious episode. Thank you for producing it. I feel like I could definitely connect with Brandon and I want to get involved. So if you do want to get involved, you can either post in the Facebook group for Chocolate Croissants about this episode, and we can put you in touch with Brandon directly, or we can point you to him, or again, you can reach out to him directly if you want to now at thebrandonbateman.com to get involved with what he's doing. So anyway, you've heard me talk enough. I would rather turn this right over to Brandon and the conversation we had. So I'm going to let that kick in a second here. As always, I want to take a moment to thank Rode Microphones for providing us with the hardware we need to bring this podcast to you every single week. They've been amazing supporters from the beginning when we had no one listening to now when we have thousands of you that are taking this podcast in on a weekly basis. So thank you to those guys. Thank you to our listeners. If you're not involved in our Facebook group, we would love for you to get involved in the conversation. You can check it out at www.facebook.com/groups/chocolate croissants. I think you'll find some really inspiring conversation there. A lot of our guests take part in the conversations there as well. So if you haven't checked it out, please do so. Request to join, and we'll get you loaded up in there. So without further ado, please enjoy the new episode 33, which is now episode 37, with my very good friend, Mr. Brandon C. Bateman. Enjoy. Hey guys, Matt Halpern here, once again coming to you from the back of the Periphery tour bus with episode 33 of the Chocolate Croissants podcast. I actually have Jake Bowen with me again today as my co-pilot. Say hi, Jake.
Hello.
Jake is back, and I hope everybody who got a chance to check out episode 32 with Jake really enjoyed it. The feedback we've been getting so far has been fantastic, and I know we touched on a lot of topics that seem to be very meaningful and helpful to a lot of you listeners. So if you had a chance to check it out and you dug it, thanks again. If you haven't, please give yourself a chance to listen. It's a little bit over an hour, and yeah, we talk about some really good stuff. Jake is here with me today because our guest today is a mutual friend of ours. Jake met this person back in 2008, and I met this person back in 2010. And when I met Brandon, he was instantly just one of the most interesting people I'd ever met, and I felt like we sort of connected and bonded pretty quickly. We became, I think, close friends without ever being friends before, and have had probably some of the, even today, like some of the most deep conversations that I've had with anybody. You know, sharing certain things with each other that we haven't really shared with many other people. And even when we haven't been together, Brandon is one of those people who will either call me or I'll call him, and we'll just touch base on things. And I don't have many friends like that. So to dig into this, our guest today is Mr. Brandon Bateman. I will let him share a little bit about himself and who he is and what his background is, because I probably wouldn't do it any justice. But before we get into that, I just kind of want to pick up from where we left off last week, because Brandon, you were just mentioning that you really liked Jake's episode, specifically one of his stories about standing up to a bully.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're comfortable with telling a story.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I'm honored to be here. My bully experience is actually this one time at band camp. So my freshman year at band camp, the upperclassmen were doing this deal in the quad where they would go around and push the freshmen, and of course one would be on their hands and knees behind the person so that they trip and fall, essentially. Me being the person I am, I took very quick notice to this and decided that I'm just going to let them kind of come to me and see how it goes. So they did. Naturally, they tried to come to me, and they did. They set up behind me, and the pusher came up to me. I timed it just right. He decided he would push. I grabbed his hands and actually pulled him down with me. It was a sacrificial drop. I knew I was going. All the while, the person on the ground rolled over onto his back. I then raised my foot up in the air and hammer kicked him in the groin as hard as I could. He cried actively in front of the entire band there in the area. And it was from that moment on, everyone knew that I was not one to mess with.
Yeah, you're like the big dog in the prison, essentially.
Basically, yeah, like pick the tough guy and beat the smack out of him. Right.
Yeah. Which, in some of the situations you've been in, I wonder how many times you've had to face that kind of experience. So that being said, maybe it's good that you give a little bit of background on yourself, because here's what I knew about you when I met you. I knew that you were a drummer who played with the Tony Danza Tap Dance Extravaganza. Excuse me, that's a fucking mouthful, no matter how many times I say it. You played with Danza, and all I knew was that you were a Marine, but I didn't know anything else. I knew from meeting you that you had an extensive knowledge of really amazing books. You had a bookshelf that was laid out in, I don't know if it was alphabetical order, but it was like the 20, 30, however many books that you believe to be the most important books ever written. But yeah, that's what I knew about you, and then I've learned so much more since then. So maybe the listeners would like to hear from you what I've learned.
Yeah, sure. And so in that regard, I used to think that my book, in fact, I think I gave you, Jake, a book to take that trip, I believe.
Are you sure it was me? Because I would remember a gesture like that.
I think maybe. Anyhow, I used to think that on my bookcase was all one needed to know about life. But that's the thing about people who are interested in reading, is they come to learn very quickly that that's never the case. Your library is ever expansive, and mine has been that indeed. So we were turned on in the Marine Corps to what's called the Commandant's Required Reading List. And so you were actually required to be spun up on a lot of industry-related reading, everything from leadership to weapons and tactics to just personal financial management. You name it, it's in there. If it makes for a better Marine, then it's on the required reading list. So that kind of started my path in I call it a endless pursuit of knowledge, right? So yeah, I was actually, I'll start before the Marine Corps. So I was in the Boy Scouts. I became an Eagle Scout. I was in the junior ROTC program in high school. I was in a youth auxiliary to the Marine Corps called the Young Marines as well. So logic would dictate that the next step, that when someone is of age, is to join the Marine Corps. So I did, and there's a bit of legacy there. My grandfather is also a Marine. He's a World War II veteran. So I was very clear, I think by the age of about 14, I had decided that I was going to be a Marine. So I really wanted two things. I wanted to be a Marine, and I wanted to get operational experience. Those were my first and foremost goals sort of in life. And I did that. And so I served in the Marine Corps. I was in the infantry. I served a total of 8 years. The last few years of that was what's called the Individual Ready Reserves, which is how I actually was able to tour with Danza. And my command was very supportive of that. In fact, a couple of them were fans of the band. So as long as I brought them swag, they didn't care. I could go out for as long as I wanted to, which was a pretty cool arrangement. After about a year, I want to say in 2010, of what I call on the shelf, I started to get that itch that a lot of dudes in our line of work get after being home and not being operational for some time. So I decided it was time to go back and do some more work, right? So I started applying for private contracting companies, was put on the shelf by a couple of them. And then about a year later, I got a call from one of them on a Wednesday afternoon that said, hey, we need you to go to work Friday. Can you go? So of course I said yes. I'm not going to tell them no. I've been dying to do this. I think what I was missing was also that sense of service, because I could continue to be involved in the global war on terrorism, although not as a Marine proper, right? And I think before I went, I decided that the Marine Corps couldn't afford me anymore. And for guys out there, brothers, I apologize for that. I know that sounds arrogant, but it was the truth. So I went and worked for a couple of different companies. I worked in Baghdad, Iraq as a close protection officer for a 2-star general over there who was a spokesperson for the United States forces in Iraq. He was also the strategic effects director for the USFI. The same company, after that project ended, took me over to Afghanistan, where I was there at an air base in the western part of the country, supervising and training a guard force of local nationals that were in charge of securing a U.S. air base. A place called Herat Shindand was the name of the area. That was an interesting project, but there's very few places on Earth where, I wonder who decided that was a nice place to start a country. I want to meet the guy that decided, I'm going to plant a flag here. I just couldn't believe it. It was awful. The worst winter I've ever experienced. It was awful. And so jumped ship to a different company with some of my other teammates, and we went over to work in Indonesia at a gold mine, which is actually happened to be the largest yielding gold and copper mineral deposit in the world. So there was about 35 or 40 of us expats there on the project that made all the other expats feel good, because obviously a gold mine is a rich target for not just theft, but for aberrant behavior as well otherwise. And then from there, actually, I'd been cultivating a relationship with my wife at the time, who I actually met back in Baghdad, and she worked for the United Nations. And so she was actually instrumental in helping me make the right connections that I needed in order to go work for the UN. So I left that project and went to go work for what's called the United Nations Office for Project Services, and that took me back to Baghdad, where I was there working with another UN agency called the High Commissioner for Refugees, who were relocating an organization of Iranian dissidents that came over to Iraq to fight the Iranians during the Iraq-Iran War. And they had just been sitting there in Iraq for the last 40 some odd years. And so finally the UN and the Iraqis and the United States Department of State said, we need to get these guys into a new home. And so essentially that was, the organization was the People's Mujahideen of Iran. People call them the Muj. So we had to find third-party host nations that were keen to take them in and get them there. Basically, that was that mission. And then I was shopped around to a couple of different UN agencies that had security holes that needed to be filled. So I ended up going to northern Iraq and to Kurdistan. And I worked in Erbil as the field safety and security advisor for another agency called the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And that's a mouthful, but it was exactly their mandate was to provide the coordination for one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world's history, which was when ISIS was making their big push in from the west, and all these internally displaced were fleeing up north. I went from a team of 6 in Baghdad to a team of 1 in Erbil. And actually earlier this evening, when I mentioned that, that was sort of that mission that decided I need to go home. This is too stressful for anyone's health. This is just not healthy. So I was actually wearing 3 hats on that mission as the CivMil coordinator between the U.S.-led coalition and the United Nations, the field security advisor for that agency, and then still a close protection officer for other UN workers and officials. So about close to 3 years ago, moved back home and decided to link up with some other prior service mates who had started consulting entities here in the U.S. They brought me on board with their organizations. We do military and law enforcement training events and consulting. I work for another company that actually we specialize in church safety team and security team training. So we train a lot of churches. In fact, we're traveling this weekend to take care of another one for this weekend. It's a 2-day training package. We'll do security vulnerability assessments of their building, and then if they don't have a team, we'll teach them how to stand it up, and then we'll even train them on top of that, and then provide follow-on services, either from products to continuing education and so on. And then I also worked with another company out of Nashville here, which is an executive protection company. So when I moved back home, the work, quote unquote work, was available to me. But what took some time, as I mentioned earlier, was finding what I considered to be my real career, my real work, which one of the consulting firm that I worked for on one of the law enforcement events turned into a lecture that I would give during the event, and it was a mindset lecture, what I'm calling operational cognition and applied psychology, specifically for SWAT police. And because of feedback from those events and from that lecture specifically, it's opened a lot of doors and sort of guided me into what I'm now. It's very clear of my purpose here is to make sure that guys are prepared mentally and spiritually, not just physically, to go and face daily threats, if that makes sense to you. So that's sort of what I'm doing now. It parallels with a lot of other relationships that I have with psychologists and both clinical and theoretical or otherwise who are keen to solve the same problems that I am. I've been traveling frequently to DC, trying to move some mountains on Capitol Hill in that regard on a nationally mandated level, particularly for law enforcement, firefighters, and emergency medical workers who are not getting psychological treatment that they need.
That's really the reason why when you and I discussed being on the podcast, I mean, that was really the main message, I think, and the main platform, or the main reason to use this platform was to talk about that mission. Before we dig into that, I mean, I wrote down the question, why couldn't they afford you?
Oh,
but that being said, when you explain the level of things that you've done, it makes sense. But I want to go a little deeper because I want to know, what is your skill set? You know what I mean? Is it the psychological side? Is it the planning side? Is it the physical side? Is it everything? I mean, you've obviously had a ton of training and a ton of experience. So where do you consider what is your skill set that you really can rely on the most?
I think it was your third or fourth example, which is everything. And so I decided a long time ago that if there's something that I don't know how to do, I at least possess the potential and the capacity to learn how to do it. And if I don't know how to do it, then I'm going to seek out those that do it masterfully, and I'm going to learn from them. So all of my skill sets have become because of that way of thinking. My skill set is that I understand that skill sets are attainable regardless of what they are.
Okay. But it's obviously based off of interest,
sure,
or necessity, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, there's certainly the tactical side of the house, like you mentioned, physical. So everything from the use of weapons, the employment of weapons, and by that I don't necessarily mean firearms or knives or grenades. In fact, in my lecture, I do my best to teach that there's only one weapon. When I walk out the door in the morning, I'm carrying one weapon, and that's the real estate between my ears. It's my mind. That everything else are tools. They're things that support any type of mission, regardless of what it is. If it's to save a life or take a life, those are just tools. So there's definitely that skill set. There's the gift, I call it, of communication, and actually being able to relate to people on a human level, rather than thinking that, keeping things strictly professional, or that I'm somehow an authoritarian figure or something like this. And because I've been at the bottom, I've been, at the lowest ranks, and I get it. So I tend to, Rudyard Kipling put it, he says, if you can walk with kings and not lose the common touch, basically, something to that. I'm paraphrasing, but I try to keep that modality with it.
With that it raises a thought in my mind, because you mentioned being able to connect with a human being in times of combat, in times when you've been on the job. How do you decide when it's a human being in front of you or a target?
Right.
Does that come down to simply whether or not your life is at risk?
That's actually a fantastic question. I've never lost sight of anyone's humanity, ever. And it's heartbreaking knowing the things that I'll call them atrocities, because they are. Anytime a human perishes at the hand of another, it's an atrocity, regardless if it was perceived as good or bad. Morally speaking, we can justify ourselves all day, but equally and opposite, those guys are just as justified in killing us as we are them. So I never lost sight of that humanity factor, but what I did define it as is a threat, right? And so if my physical or well-being, or that of my clients or my family or my loved ones or whomever, if there's a choice, well, obviously the choice is, it's very clear as to which side I'm going to go with. I mean, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel that way. So they're still humans,
right?
But they are threats, and sometimes threats need to be stopped,
right?
If that makes sense to you. Interesting side note about that is there's a fantastic author and colleague that I follow. His name's Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He's a retired fellow. He's, in fact, the only author to have 2 published works that are on that Marine Corps Commandant's required reading list. They're called On Killing and On Combat. Fantastic reads, right? So in On Killing, he described what we call the hit rate, or the kill rate of U.S. forces on enemy forces, and how during the Second World War they were very, very low. That the soldiers on the battlefield, the Marines on the battlefield, had a very clear, natural, they had zero interest in taking the life of another human being. And so they were firing, but they were intentionally missing because they didn't want to kill anyone. They wanted to play the part, and they wanted to be present, of course, but they didn't want to actually kill anyone. Now I think that's a natural thing, right? Of course, we're not born thinking, hey, I want to go overseas and kill people. It's definitely conditioned, right? And so in the Vietnam War, they found that the hit rate dramatically increased. Was it because the enemy was nastier or meaner or uglier? No. What they found was actually very simple. There was a training tool during the Second World War, which was the target upon which they used to practice shooting. And it was a bullseye ring circular target. When they started training for the Vietnam War, they switched to human silhouette targets. There was a psychological operant, what's called operant conditioning, that happened to those soldiers, sailors, Marines, and whomever, where they're now conditioned to shoot at a humanoid figure rather than a circle on the battlefield. So their mind has already dealt with that fact that at a distance, a black silhouette paper target looks just like a human being downrange, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense to me. This may be funny to some listeners, or even to you, but when I've seen movies like Full Metal Jacket, and they're in the Marine Corps and they're training for Vietnam,
right?
It's all about, what's my job? Kill. Right. Is that similar to the training that you went through to be a killing machine? Obviously you weren't in Vietnam,
right?
How old are you, by the way?
I'm 33.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the 3 of us are about the same age, but did you go through similar training to where that's what you were conditioned for? Absolutely, yes.
The Marine Corps is steeped in traditions of they have mastered violence of action. We wouldn't exist as a nation but for the violence of action of those guys. And it's Hollywood has exaggerated it quite a bit, but it's very we are absolutely. They use language such as kill, such as and there's choice language used by the drill instructors in boot camp, of course. Not as dramatic as Full Metal Jacket made it out to be, but yeah, the conditioning factor was absolutely there.
Sure.
Muse, last record, where they had the Psycho Killer, Psycho is the name of the track, and
yeah.
They actually have samples of it's Marine Corps boot camp, but of this recruit being yelled at by his drill instructor saying, say I am a psycho killer, and the recruit responds, I am a psycho killer. So that was a bit exaggerated. In fact, I was a little bit upset with Muse for making that sort of claim, because that couldn't be further from the truth. We do not cultivate psychopaths intentionally. We cultivate killers. Now, and I want to make that distinction because, by the way, every single person, regardless if you're trained to kill or not, has psychopathic tendencies. What matters is your degree of control over your empathy, if that makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating book I just finished called The Good Psychopath's Guide to Success. It's a fantastic read. You guys should check it out. It's actually quite funny. It's a co-author deal between a British SAS operator and then another British clinical psychologist, but pretty excellent read. He talks a lot about the psychopath in everyone.
Is there a TED Talk by that same person?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Because I saw a TED Talk about psychopaths, and it was quite fascinating. I don't want to dig too much into that now because it's been a while since I saw it and I can't really remember the specifics, but a lot of our listeners do take advice on what books to read. So as we go, if you have other recommendations,
oh sure, yeah.
Please do. But so with all of this training, with the things that you've been through, what now? Because again, I want to get into the big mission, but what are you using now to help civilians that you learned from a more tactical standpoint? And not even just civilians, but as you said, SWAT teams and police officers. Are you physically training them with weapons? Are you physically I know you do Krav Maga. Like
Yes.
Does that come from your training in the military as well?
Oh, certainly. And yes. And so the short answer is yes. We do a lot of, with the various organizations I work with, the one particular that we do the law enforcement events with, yes, it is a multiple day tactical package at a facility and we travel around the country doing this. Different agencies will host us on it. It's a few day event that includes 1, 2, or 3 different officers from different agencies within like a 6-hour drive. So it's actually an interagency event. And what's fascinating to me about that, kind of what we were discussing earlier about this alpha inhibitor that I talk about in my lecture, a lot of these dudes, when they don't know each other and they walk into the same room, there's an immediate air of arrogance, and there's these stone walls, and they're not speaking to each other, and they're visually kind of sizing each other up and see who's going to be the big dog on the range and all this stuff. And of course, as it turns out, without fail, none of them are level 7 or even 6 level, but 1 to 10 operators. But there's that attitude, right? So one of the things I do before I even start an event is I treat it like fellowship in church. I ask the question, does anyone here personally know every single person in this room? Of course, the answer is no. So I say, we're going to take these next 5 minutes. Everybody's going to stand up, shake hands with every single person in this room, introduce yourself, tell them where you're from, what agency you're with, your favorite color, you married, kids. It's an immediate icebreaker, and it changes the mood of the event, which is what makes our event, I think, one of the things that makes our event very unique, and then why we're getting the reviews that we're getting after the fact. So yeah, it's physical, and of course including that mental psychological lecture. It's been life-changing. I've had guys actually give me that kind of feedback. They've literally used the words, "You've saved my life." The language that they hear in terms of treatment from their agency is, "Oh, you were involved in a critical incident, you were involved in a shooting, take a few days off, paid leave, go talk to this lady. Oh, and by the way, have her sign this because otherwise you can't come back to work," right? And if you come back saying that you have any type of problems, mental problems, or that if you're on medication, you risk losing your job. And what's more, the culture in law enforcement is as such, it's a very much, like I said, the stonewall approach. You'll be perceived as weak, as you're just a non-hacker because you can't stand up to the trauma, if that makes sense.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. Can you dig in a little bit to that topic of the alpha inhibitor?
Yes.
Because we've discussed this on our podcast previously. We had a friend by the name of Daniel Beretta who was also in the military. And just briefly, Daniel tells a story. He was in a motorcycle accident while he was still in the military, and he crashed into the back of a truck and basically severed his left shoulder without it actually coming off. And they didn't amputate at the time. Now he's an amputee and is much happier, but his arm was there, but it was completely dead. And during the time that he was at the VA in recovery, he talks about one day his shoe came untied, and he would be damned if he was going to ask another man to tie his shoe. And he walked around for about an hour in tears, basically deciding what to do.
Wow.
and how to remedy this problem of something as simple as tying your shoe. And as you and I discussed, like, I'm personally going through this right now with my father. My dad, and for those listening, you may catch wind of this. You may have caught wind that I've been dealing with a family issue over the past few weeks while I've been on tour and even before the tour. But my father was in Vietnam, and he's a veteran and pretty serious special forces guy, and he absolutely has a lot of trouble asking for help, admitting that he's human, admitting that there's something wrong. And it's a big part of the problem that I'm dealing with right now. So it's a very real subject for me. It's very raw right now. It's hard to even talk about in some ways. So that's why, I guess, since you touched on it, I really would like to hear your thoughts on this idea of the alpha inhibitor and what a man should do.
Right. Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll actually pull an excerpt from the chapter.
Please.
If you'd like.
Yeah.
So, and I'm glad that you just said it, because it proves my first sentence, and that is, you've all seen it. So you've all seen it, you've all encountered it in some way or another. It is not limited to the tactical environment, nor is it limited to a particular gender, right? Many of us have heard it called the alpha male syndrome. I disagree with the title, as I'll call it a disease, or the syndrome. It most certainly does not apply to the male gender specifically. I've seen it mostly in private sector contracting and in all areas of law enforcement. Side note, these guys are plagued with it, right? We didn't seem to experience much of it in the Marine Corps. Maybe I was in a unique unit, I don't know. So what is the alpha inhibitor? The alpha, simply put, it's a state of being and believing that one achieves wherein they cannot be taught anything new. They cannot be proven incorrect, especially by those in their charge. They cannot be seen as being inferior or less capable by their subordinates, peers, or superiors. This state of being often includes an inhibition to continuing education because of the fact that they would be seen being taught by someone else in front of their peers. Common causes are age is one, self-importance and or stroked ego by way of promotions or time and grade or status, peer reverence, institutional adoration, etc. So yeah, it's a real thing, and it plagues everyone. I've never seen any worse cases than that in law enforcement, particularly the SWAT community, and here's why. They're told they're special in their title. Special Weapons and Tactics, SRT, Special Response Team, right? So when they join that team, there's an inflated ego that's attached with it. They're told they're special.
My father was Special Forces.
So here's the thing, and actually that might be why I didn't see a lot of it in the Marine Corps. Nobody told us we're special. We don't have to be told. We just perform, right? The proof is in the results. So I think it has a lot to do with it in terms of titles and so on. That's the alpha inhibitor.
Right. Yeah, it hits home pretty deeply for me, as I said, because I think that is part of the reason why some of the challenges that I'm facing personally with him are really coming to light. And I think in some ways a lot of what's happening could have been prevented if the mentality was different. So my question to you is, how do we change this?
Yeah.
How do we help people that do feel like they can't let someone teach them?
Right. So that's a great question, and it's the question I've been trying to crack for several years now. What I've tried to do is narrow it down to a 3-tier audience analysis, which by that I mean you have administration level, folks that actually can write policy and implement policy and procedure and practice. You have, I'll go to the opposite end, you have the guys on the ground. You got the special forces, you got the SWAT, the police, the regular police, even the civilian contractors, you got the end users, the firefighters, the emergency medical technicians, and so on. And then you have the middle, and that middle is actually everyone else. So who does that include? That includes the public, right? That includes public perception. And this also ties over into the post-traumatic stress world, because a lot of employers are less keen to employ someone that has post-traumatic stress. Why? Because they're viewed as being unstable, so they don't want to hire them, so they're therefore further victimizing it. How do we stop it? I think it comes from both directions. Like if you want to sort of meet in the middle, it's got to come from the ground, on the ground level, and that comes by way of educating the troops, educating the cops, by way of either literature or touring seminars or whatever the case is, and getting these guys to admit that they're human. Perfect example of this, I had the great honor to lecture one of the Special Forces groups out at Fort Campbell, one of the teams. They asked me to come in and give my lecture before they deployed last year. And my partner who booked the event actually went to them and said, hey, is there anything particular that you guys are wanting to get out of this that I can tell Brandon so he can sort of better prepare for you guys? And they actually came back with a question. And the question was very interesting to me. They said, how do we flip the switch, go down range, do our work, come back home, and then flip the switch back off and be normal? Which is a very interesting question. And I didn't want to, give an instant answer. I actually milled on it for about 2 days or so. My answer was actually quite simple, is that it's impossible. You can't. What you should do instead is accept the fact that you're a human being and learn basic brain science and learn how incidents affect you and how you can actually develop coping mechanisms other than escapisms to actually deal with it. And a lot of it just comes from support, peer support. So anyway, how that ties into how do we fix that problem in terms of the author is getting peers to agree with the fact that they're not invincible, that they're not stone walls, that they're also human beings. Unfortunately for law enforcement, it needs to also come from policy, because the problem is that if a guy is perceived as having an issue, he risks reputation and or job loss. So they're far less likely to want to actually seek any type of proper treatment, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does. And, when we were talking before the podcast, it didn't occur to me until now, but so my sister had two very good friends, two twin brothers, Adam and Dan, and they were both Marines. And Dan isn't here anymore because he couldn't cope with certain things, and he ended up taking his own life.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much this plague, this issue that you're talking about, leads down that path, because people in this position feel like they don't have a way to ask for help.
Right. It very much so does. In fact, a couple of Marines from my unit have ended their own life because they couldn't see the options. The treatment's not given, first of all, and what treatment that is given is either subpar. It's just not working. And it's interesting that the reason why I'm committed so much to the law enforcement side is it's a very personal issue for me, because these are my friends, these are my peers, my colleagues. A lot of military veterans become police officers, so they're actually carrying over a lot of that baggage from these last two conflicts, this global war on terror. They're carrying that stuff over into the law enforcement community, which a lot of folks tend to forget is one of the most stressful jobs in the world. Maintaining rule of law and order. And for anyone that's anti-cop, I'll invite you to go spend a week in Somalia, or go spend a week in the Sudan where there are no police, and see how much you appreciate them. It's a shame, right? And so it's a thankless job. It's remarkably stressful. And a lot of these guys, we have a lot of organizations that are out there promoting suicide prevention and suicide awareness for military veterans, because there's a lot of great progress in that world. We're Mission 22 kill, all these organizations, 22 veterans a day are killing themselves. We're trying to raise awareness. We're aware. We get it. The thing that the vast majority of the public are not aware of are how many police officers are killing themselves daily, how many firefighters, how many emergency medical technicians. These guys are experiencing trauma on the EMS side literally daily, right? Now, they're not actively in gunfights, but they're seeing babies that have been charred. They're seeing people decapitated and dismembered in vehicle wrecks. They're experiencing traumatic incidents, right? They're seeing vivid depictions of human pain and suffering and violence. It's traumatic. You've got firefighters who see it weekly, if not more. You got law enforcement who's seeing it. We're looking at, news feeds every other day. It's happening across the country. And the best they're being told is, hey, hang in there, Tiger. Suck it up. Don't be perceived as weak.
So it's
no wonder that guys are suffering in silence and killing themselves.
Yeah. Well, and my question is there no widespread government-based program or even locally based program that is offering this service to these people? I mean, does that exist to your knowledge?
Short answer, no.
Okay.
And that's actually that's what I'm calling my mountain. This is one of the talks that I'm having in DC is to establish a federally funded, nationally mandated, basically version of, hopefully better managed version of the VA for specifically law enforcement, fire, and emergency medical workers. It doesn't exist. It's left up to individual agencies. And then the first question that's asked, just like everything else, is who's going to pay for that?
Right. Like, where's the budget come from?
And so it's interesting. All you have to do is look at the United Nations. Who pays for the United Nations? Donor states. So you have 50 donor states here in the country that can donate to standing up such an organization. It's doable. I mean, is that the right answer? I don't know. I don't have the right answer, but all I know is that uphill battles have been won.
Why hasn't it been done?
It's a great question.
And also, who else is working towards this goal?
That's a great question. I've been able to link up with a few people that are working in similar circles. I've yet to encounter anyone with this degree of interest, which is a shame, actually. You have guys that like to raise awareness, or that they will profess bleeding hearts for the suicides of law enforcement and first responders, but nobody seems to be doing anything about it. And the question of why hasn't it been done? It's a great question. I don't know why. I think a lot of it probably has to do with funding. I think a lot of it has to do with leadership. I also feel like if they were to stand up such an entity, someone's going to have to admit that they've been doing it wrong this whole time, and that's where that alpha inhibitor comes in.
I mean, that's the catch-22 of it all.
Yeah.
Who's
to blame, right? Nobody's going to want to stand up and say, oh, well, here's how we've done it forever, but guess what? We were completely wrong, and here's how we're going to start doing it. That's going to be a very difficult pill to swallow.
I guess so, but from the other standpoint or the other argument would be, maybe the direction should be to not frame it that way, to simply say, it's no one's fault. We're not looking to blame somebody.
Exactly.
In fact,
exactly.
We're trying to make people feel comfortable enough to come forward and say, I need help, instead of saying, it's not my fault.
Right.
Yeah. I was just gonna add, like, how do you approach extolling the virtues of mental health and helping people develop coping mechanisms for these various lines of work that are incredibly traumatic? Like, how you said it's an uphill battle. Like, what is in your experience? What is that battle? Like, how do you go to DC and try to make change? Yeah,
it's that 3-tier approach. It has to come from an administration in order to actually affect policy. That's number one. But honestly, the biggest thing for me is convincing the end users that it's okay to admit that you're affected by something, right?
Right.
That is probably the biggest challenge that I think, and it's mainly in law enforcement. I've actually seen some great work coming out of the firefighter side of the house. There's a Canadian organization that's done some fantastic work in suicide prevention for firefighters as well. But there are, not to say that those organizations don't exist for law enforcement, but they certainly don't exist on a national level. And what's more is that, again, it goes back to risking job loss, risking reputation loss. Somehow we have to change their mindset, which I'm confident I can do, to make them understand that they're humans as well, regardless of how long they've been in the business or how old they are or how many bodies they've slayed or whatever they want to say. They're humans, when you're talking about this stuff to other people that can help change things and steer things in a more positive direction, is it difficult to show them that this kind of
emphasis on helping people and helping people cope and giving and putting an emphasis on mental health, do they see that it will make people more efficient? It will make people, deal with this stuff better and to be able to return to various forms of work with a stronger mind? Like, is that a difficult thing to explain to people?
It's not, actually. I've been very fortunate in that the meetings that I have been having have been met with some very interested, raised eyebrows. And I can tell by their expressions that they're genuinely interested in the idea, and they think it's a good idea. They think it's provocative. They think it's, and again, similar to what you said, Matt, they have this look as if, why hasn't this been done? Almost, it's like they're dumbfounded as to why.
That's relieving to hear.
Yeah. So there is light at the end of that tunnel for sure. And a lot of it is also the biggest, in my opinion, one of the hardest mountains to move is the stigmatization of trauma. And so that is probably the hardest thing to uproot right now.
Right. Well, and one of the things that you and I were discussing is that words are powerful, right? The words that we use to describe someone who's seen trauma,
right,
not only affects them, but it affects the people in their lives, and it affects the perception. So what you actually said to me something that, and I don't know if this is more of a widespread or newer term being used, but I believe you referred to it as post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
Instead of, or post-traumatic stress.
No, just post-traumatic growth. Yes, very good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that something that is being talked about?
It is being talked about in certain clinical circles, yes, but only if and when the end user actually gets to the treatment, and it's not with everybody. And what's interesting is because it became a very sexy topic, like it became in the care providing world of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists or otherwise mental health providers, it became a very sexy topic. So everyone wanted to get on top of it, I guess, because I don't know, they felt they could help, or they felt compelled that they should help something like this, because it is a massive issue. The problem is that they're still learning classical diagnosis. They're still learning classical language in the schools that they're going to. And, you got a kid that's 21, 22 years old, comes home from Helmand Province, who's just seen the worst kind of hell you can imagine. And you sit him down with an authoritarian figure that works for the Veterans Administration and says, hey, you're disorderly. That's an authoritarian figure telling that kid. And so guess what he's going to do? He's going to go home and he's going to believe it. So that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's self-perpetuating problem. And then, and by the way, take this prescription, take 2 of these daily. And by the way, good luck getting a job. So even further victimizing those people. So we're experiencing, it's like we have to survive encounters on multiple levels. You got to first survive it physically when the actual traumatic incident occurs. Then we have to survive it again when we get home with the war with civilization. And in many ways, guys are further victimized by the process here than they were to begin with in whatever traumatic incident they encountered. So yeah, language is very powerful, and shifting, what I'd like to see is a change in the actual language used in the diagnosis. So I'm not going to go to the American Psychiatric Association and say, hey, I want you to change the words in your diagnosis Bible. But what I would like to see is that in the actual clinical treatment, that we're not saying certain things to these guys. Because here's the thing, here's the fact. And this might offend some people, and if it does, I apologize. But it's backed by some pretty significant data. All you have to do is look at ASVAB scores. The guys that are most likely to experience trauma in combat, in the military specifically, are guys that are the lowest scoring cats on aptitude tests, right? Because you got to have good brains to be a pilot. You got to be, to be an engineer, all these other things. So when kids go into the recruiting station, they take that ASVAB. It's like, great, you've scored just high enough to be in the infantry. Congratulations, you're going to war, right? So not only are they the first ones to get in there, they're the ones who are most likely to not understand how to cope and deal and to not understand brain science. Am I saying that all guys in the infantry are dumb? Certainly not. Am I saying that all cops are dumb? Certainly not. What I'm saying is that the vast majority of them are not brain scientists. But there's very simple language that we can use and actually start educating these guys that will help a lot more than what they're being given now, which is literally nothing. a lot of cops, in particular in the SWAT world, they'll even refer to themselves as knuckle draggers. It's almost like a badge of pride to be, the big dumb brute that just kicks in doors and wraps people up. That's also, I think, one of the cultural attitudes that needs to change. The idea of being educated and intelligent needs to become just as sexy as knowing how to shoot at 1,000 yards.
So then, how do you limit, or rather, how do you regulate that? Because it seems like if there is a predisposition to trauma and not knowing how to deal with it, is it like is there do you lower the level in which you allow people to then participate, or raise the level? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, how do you fix that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, actually. So there are some wheels being turned right now on the Department of Defense side. So at least in the military, a project that they've just wrapped that I think they're going to start implementing either next year or hopefully later this year. So I'll give you an example. So in the Marine Corps, in a rifle platoon, you're given a sailor, a Navy corpsman. So he's our medic, right? They attach to our unit. If you want to survive wounds physically, as an infantry operator, it'd be a good idea to have someone that has a very solid skill set on pre-hospital trauma care, combat, casualty care.
Right.
It makes sense, right?
Right.
So logic would dictate that if you want guys to survive mentally as well on the battlefield, why not attach a mental health provider to your unit? These corpsmen, they go and train with us. They're guys out there, your corpsmen, you're my brothers, right? They're treated as Marines as well. So having that psych provider who's also just as trained, he goes to the same boot camp, he goes through all the same training, he just has that little bit extra to bring to it. I think that's a fantastic way, is to actually attach a healthcare provider that can blow through all the BS and all the psychobabble and actually educate, because there's a lot of downtime in the field too. And you can use that downtime to train dudes and spin dudes up and say, hey, when we get over there, here's how you're going to start thinking and seeing things, and here's how you're going to feel about it, and here's, they're going to start educating these guys.
Yeah.
So that's one way, I think that probably the best thing I've heard in terms of trying to, cut it off at the head, so to speak. So there's that preemptive side that's extremely important, and that comes from education. And then, of course, there's the post in terms of treatment. So, how do we marry them all together is the big question. And how do we provide that same level of support for law enforcement?
Right. It's funny, you see in movies like, like look at Lethal Weapon, when Riggs has to go talk to the police department shrink.
Yeah.
And it's like a big joke.
Yes. Exactly.
It is that the sentiment, essentially?
Oh, most definitely. And that's actually, that's a great segue, and it's a great example of how pop culture influences reality, and particularly widespread use of violence. There's a lot of research that backs this up. In fact, Dave Grossman, who I mentioned earlier, he's actually got a recent release that I just finished, which is, I can't say enough good things about it. It's called Assassination Generation. It's a co-authored effort, and it's essentially about the effects that media violence has on people and has on a population. For years and years, our parents and grandparents grew up watching Westerns, which would, it had violence in it, but it was certainly a lot more mild than what we see today. And then add on top of that hours and hours of unrestricted use of extremely vivid and violent video games, not just movies, but TV, video game, all these sorts of things. Those have an effect on reality. You'd be foolish to deny it. And again, there's great data to support the arguments. Very compelling arguments indeed, that how pop culture can influence reality. And so yeah, when guys like that in Lethal Weapon go in there, this is this is how that cop that watched that movie when he was a kid is how he's going to treat that meeting. It's a joke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I bring it up. It seems to be the way that it's perceived, but what's scary is that it is the reality now.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why it's great that you're doing the work you're doing to change that, to try and change that.
Yeah.
To change the perception. So I want to, unless you want to keep going down this road, I want to change gears just a little bit.
Sure.
Because you mentioned a lot of downtime in the field,
yes,
which both Jake and I can relate to in our own line of work. I mean, there's a ton of downtime on tour. We have the hours here and there, the times here and there we need to go and do things every day. But obviously we're not typically under fire or in threatening situations for the most part. Although we did play in Atlanta yesterday, where the day before someone was murdered in the same venue.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing.
You bring up a good point. Like, we're not in combat, but with the way that the news kind of perpetrates what is going on in our country when it comes to like mass shootings and being in public places, and you feel very, very vulnerable in these situations. So I just want to put it out there that, like, even though we're not in combat and I'm not making any sort of comparisons, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I wasn't at least a little bit concerned being on stage or being in a public place or walking in Times Square where,
right.
you know, it's just these are thoughts that go through people's minds.
I will draw that comparison for you, and I will say that, and I'm going to use the Vegas incident as an example. That entire incident, every single person there is officially certified combat veteran. They have experienced human contention at one of the most ridiculous levels. You know, it's not outside the realm of possibility for it to happen anywhere. So I don't think it's an unfair statement at all. You guys are very vulnerable, especially then I can't go to any crowded place without my back to the wall. You know, is that hypervigilance? No, it's just vigilance. It's just being aware of my space. I want to be able to see everything that's around me, because guess what? It's not Mayberry anymore. It's a different world. And we see almost daily now that folks are out to hurt each other. So we can be the foolish one and keep our head in the sand, or we can be the wise one and, you know, be aware of our space and be prepared for those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah, it is frightening. I mean, you mentioned the Vegas incident. We were just talking about how Dimebag Darrell, you know, was assassinated on stage. I mean, there's not a show that I play where something like that doesn't cross my mind. But there's this also voice in the back of my head that's kind of like, no, that's not going to happen. It's you know, it's like winning the lottery.
Right.
It's so rare.
It is, and that's I think the only thing that still justifies it in people's minds.
But it's not, though. It's not. I mean, it is rare, I guess, but it's also in our line of work, we're the first ones to hear about it,
right?
And we're the first ones, I think, to really be scared of it.
Sure.
Well, you say it's rare, and yeah, I guess data would point to the fact that it doesn't happen as frequently as, I guess, as bombastic as the media reports it does. But like, just one of these incidents is unacceptable. I don't, you know, it's just like, that's kind of the way that I feel about it. Yeah, data points that it's rare, but like, this shouldn't be.
No, certainly. And I encourage everyone that I speak with to never, ever lose their sense of outrage that we have to think like this. This is not normal. It should not be normal. It is not okay that I have to stand with my back against the wall. It's not okay.
Yeah.
But it's the reality.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. When we went out to eat earlier, like, I kind of let you choose, or I didn't let you, but I stood back and watched where you choose to sit.
Yeah.
You know, and that was a thought that crossed my mind, because I was going to, you know, go down and sit, but I was like, you know what, like, maybe Brandon's going to be a little bit more sensitive to where he sits than I am, and I don't want to take that seat. I don't know why. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But I think about that, and I try to learn from those situations, because I have that. We've talked about this before.
Mm-hmm.
The last time I was actually in Nashville, we were walking down the street and we were discussing how can we tell a threat from 50 yards, 100 yards, 20 yards away, and how do we prevent a threat from that far?
Yeah.
You know, and you simply just were saying, you know, use your eyes and use your intuition, and don't let anybody ever get that close.
Essentially, yes.
You know?
So I teach my Krav Maga students a very fundamental rule, and that's the best fight you can have is the one you don't have to have.
Right.
The fight you don't have is the one you win 100% of the time. And so just by being simply aware of your space and aware of your travel plans and aware of travel plans of others, what we call it in the military, the acronym was EMPCO, or the enemy most probable course of action. So by, you know, reading a space and saying, oh, that guy will probably walk that direction, so I'll walk the other, for example. But yeah, little things like that. It's just an awareness. You know, so many folks are too tuned into their smartphone when they walk out of the grocery store, which is unfortunate because, like, for example, solo attacks on vulnerable female victims happens to be, the vast majority of them happen in transitional spaces, which are parking structures, parking lots, things like this, from going from point A to point B, and they know that their head's going to be down in their smartphone rather than up and looking around. Interesting, one of my partners, further to that point, one of my partners was on FBI task force for some time, and he had the great opportunity to interview a lot of batterers and rapists and guys like this, convicted felons that had executed violent attacks on females, and he actually asked them these questions like, what do you look for in a victim? What's your type, so to speak? And they actually said something quite profound, like, our type is whatever type is available, and by that they meant the ones that are not paying attention to their surroundings, and if they will simply look at them, they go under the idea that they've already been identified, and they're far less likely to attack that person.
Well, I made a note of that because it's just, I know so many women that live in, for example, from Baltimore City. My girlfriend lives in Baltimore City. Right. It's a constant concern of mine when she's out at night and will go home, and it's like, is she taking an Uber? And even in the Uber, how safe is that? Mm-hmm. And we don't. I guess we haven't really seen many crimes that occur in that world, or at least if there are right. like transit crimes like that with Uber and with Lyft and these companies. Mm-hmm. It's just surprising to me that there aren't more. And I know it sounds really bad.
Well, I think I think I know why. It's because they've already been identified. They're part of a system. They're in the computer. Their name pops up on their phone. Like it's almost self-deterrent. So it
is.
You can't stay anonymous when you're driving a cab around, and right. You can't. A lot of people wouldn't take that risk.
It's still pretty scary. You
never know who you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. To make this a little bit lighter, my question about downtime in the field was sort of headed towards what do you do to keep yourself entertained? What do you do to keep yourself from not having to sit there and watch the clock just tick, 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 tick?
Sure.
How do you keep yourself busy with the downtime in the field? Because you and I were discussing, not to cut you off, but you and I were discussing, there's certain times in our lives where the clock is just ticking so slowly.
Yeah.
And that's when you kind of know that you're just not stoked.
Yeah.
But those other times, how do you fill that space?
Yeah, so a lot of dudes will turn to, particularly in the military, we've filled a lot of time with each other's interests, because at a lot, after so many days downrange, you start to figure out that your personal interest gets old. So you start reaching out to each other to fill those gaps. What's your hobby? Can you teach me how to do that? Can you teach me how to play guitar? Can you teach me how to lift weights? Can you teach me how to, play spades, or whatever your thing is, So that helped a lot, and having that amount of different attitudes and personalities available to you was very helpful. In my own personal downtime here now, when I don't have a infantry platoon to pick at, I spend a lot of time in my garage. I'm a woodworker. I make things, not just a woodworker. I call myself a maker. So I like to solve problems with material. So if I've got a need in the house, I'll build it. Or if someone comes to me and says, "Hey, can you make this for me?" Yes, I can. I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. And yes, I will. And I usually do. And it turns out I'm quite good at it. So I quite enjoy that. I do a lot of reading. I do a lot of listening. I, of course, love still listening to music. But my time is rarely unoccupied, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Which is, it's good to hear that, because I think there's a lot of people that don't necessarily know how to occupy their time. They don't know what hobbies they have.
Right.
Me and Jake have even discussed this, for myself, I a lot of times feel like I need more hobbies that aren't necessarily work-related hobbies.
Yeah, it's healthy.
It is. And for someone like yourself who even said, if you didn't know how to do something, you wanted to learn how to do it. If there was a tactic or a skill as part of your skill set, what you're doing, that you didn't know, at least you knew that your talent was that you could figure it out.
Yes.
How would you suggest that someone finds a hobby to fill their time with? What do you think about that? Because we've had people give this answer this question before on the podcast.
How do people find hobbies?
Yeah, and how did you find yours so clearly? I mean, was this just things you've done your whole life? Are is making things, for example, is that something you've done your whole life, or is that something you discovered?
My relationship with tools goes back to I was 6 years old, and that comes from crafts and things like that in the Boy Scouts. That's a great organization. They do a great job about occupying the time, and so I started using power tools by the time I was 8 or 10 or something like this, and that just sort of cultivated and became its own monster. And as far as other folks, like some of the things that I got interested in, even quite recently, perhaps, might have just been from watching a video on it and thinking, that's really cool. Hey, I could probably do that. And then you kind of start probing the waters and seeing how difficult or how time or money consuming it is, and then you make that decision. I think everybody kind of has that thing sitting in the back of their head. They're like, I'd like to do that someday. Do it.
I think, I mean, that's really the philosophy that I think you're getting at, is just like try it. And I think a lot of people are apprehensive because they think that like they're just not going to be good at it right off the bat, and that's probably true. They probably will not be good at it, but there's this as long as you have the motivation and the ambition to just try it, you won't ever know. And it's a very simple concept, but people get in their own head and they stop themselves from even trying it. And that's a huge, that holds people back a lot.
There's a revelation, and understand, I came to it at some point. I don't think I can tell you exactly when it happened for me, but there is that moment where you realize, and it's such a powerful thing, where you realize that you can do things. Folks, I think too many people see something that they think is cool, and the story they immediately tell themselves is, well, I can't do that, right? I never thought, necessarily 15 years ago that I would be playing the mandolin, but here I am playing the mandolin because I've always loved it, and I was like, man, someday I'm going to do that. And then when I finally had the time to do it, I bought a mandolin and started playing. It's a very percussive instrument, so it resonates with me. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up this idea of, self-doubt. I guess is the best way to describe it. I'm reading something right now that is talking about experts in general, people that are experts about a certain topic, and how you can essentially turn something that you're an expert about, or an expert in some kind of skill, into a business, right? Yeah. But so many people who are experts, even who are perceived or would be considered experts because they know more about something than the general population, still have this feeling of, I'm not an expert. Like, how can I call myself an expert? Right. I don't know more than this person who taught me, so why am I the expert? And that's just, I don't know. It's an interesting thing to me right now, because I'm thinking about, in my life, what areas am I an expert? In what areas am I an expert in, and what things can I share with other people? And I'm just curious how you've discovered that about yourself, because obviously you have an expertise, you're putting it to good use now to help people, and I think that's the goal. How did you discover that? So, and how did you get the balls to say, obviously I don't think you have much trouble having balls to do a lot of things with the things you've been through, but I mean, even still, it's like that takes self-confidence to put yourself out there as a expert in front of people who are very strong-minded.
Yes, this is an excellent question. In fact, I hesitate to say that it was me alone that decided that I could speak with some level of authority on it. And a lot of it comes from a struggle that I had for years about something that we're crazy about here, not just in America, but a lot of other Western cultures, is this idea of credentialism, and this idea that there's some level of expertise that's attached to some type of degree or certification, which couldn't be any further from the truth.
Yep.
It's probably one of the most damaging fallacies that we've ever experienced in modern life, in that you go to a 4-year, get a 4-year, 8-year, whatever degree, and all of a sudden you're now a master of the craft. which is completely wrong way to think about it. It bothers me so much that there's a lot of people that are given a platform and they abuse these credentials, and they're actually giving horrible advice.
Right.
First of all, they're giving advice to begin with. They're not teaching people how to help themselves, but they're claiming that they can help everybody. But they're giving them the wrong advice. And so I'm very adamant in that. Like, for example, when this book is published, you know, I a lot of books I pick up and it'll say authored by Dr. So-and-so or so-and-so PhD or so-and-so. That's a stamp of authority that, you know, a lot of folks will glance at, either consciously or subconsciously, will think, hey, that person knows what they're talking about. So it inevitably sells more books. I get it. I've actually been toying with the idea, jokingly, writing by not a Dr. Brandon Bateman.
Right.
Because I want to make that point. I want to make it very clear. So
right.
What makes me an expert? I don't call myself an expert, but what I have found is that the way that I communicate with people, because I've been there and done that, and because I resonate with those dudes on a human level, I've been very effective, and the feedback has been very strong. And they're far more likely to want to listen to people like me than Dr. So-and-so.
Right. And if you can see visibly that you're helping someone,
yes,
and they tell you and you know it, that should be the credential.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and so that was the moment. I kind of briefly mentioned it in the car when I started reading post-event surveys. And there were particularly a couple of cases of guys that I read things that said my lecture changed saved their life. I had a gentleman that wrote to me about 2 weeks after an event and told me that my lecture alone has solved post-traumatic stress issues he's been having for over 15 years. So yes, it's very telling, you know. And these are issues that the Veterans Administration and even his agency couldn't help him deal with. He used the word solved, and that was that pivotal moment for me where I realized, okay, I've got something here. I know how to talk to these guys, and I know how to make them listen.
Right. Well, that's great that you recognize that for yourself, because it is going to help a lot of other people, you know. And it's funny. I got kind of excited when you said that, because it was the next point in this book that I'm reading, which was that part of the reason why people don't take that leap into doing the thing they want to do as an expert or an educator is because they don't feel like they have the credential to do so or the degree to do so. Right. And that is just
poisonous
bullshit.
It's a lot of wasted experience that could go into helping people and educating people, and it really, like, that's the credential, is to your applied experience can help people.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
That's what you want to do. And it, you know, I think the whole focus and emphasis on having a degree or a plaque or whatever you want to call it is just a distraction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've experienced that a lot with some of the law enforcement personalities that I've encountered. Brandon C. Bateman is not a law enforcement officer. So who am I to be, you know, lecturing these guys? And I can't help but laugh in the face of that argument, because clearly what I'm saying is helping these guys. That's who I am to be talking to these dudes. I don't have to be a cop to teach a cop how to deal with trauma. Does that make sense to you?
No, you just have to be someone who's dealt with trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's such an open book, you know.
Right.
It's an asinine argument.
So speaking of that, when you and I talked a bunch of weeks back, we discussed that there was these different pivotal moments in your life, moments that helped you realize things just about essentially what you're doing now, but also just big moments. And I know that there's a couple different pivotal days, pivotal experiences. I'm curious if you're interested in sharing any one of those as a way that could potentially help somebody else.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, so the way I describe it, because I actually use one of these examples in my lecture, and the way I describe it to these guys is, first of all, you cannot outright prevent traumatic incidents. You can't say, okay, I'm going to go out and I'll never experience trauma. We don't have that ability, right? So preparing for it is not, it's not a Chicken Little circumstance. The sky is falling. You know, we're not crazy for thinking that we should be prepared for these sorts of things. And so I'll draw the parallel. And why do you practice with your firearm, officer so-and-so? Well, so I can be accurate with it. Okay, so why don't you practice with your mind as well, so that you're better prepared, to deal with threats when they come, and that trauma can be a perceived threat to your mind, right? So there's that whole sort of parallel idea there. For me, the didactic approach that I took, and what's interesting is I came to this conclusion in about 2005 after my first deployment in 2004. I came to the conclusion without being able to articulate it. I couldn't share it with anyone. I didn't know how to describe what I was feeling and thinking. I just knew that I was feeling it and thinking it, right? And so what I decided about mid-2005 was that I've had the worst day of my life. It's done. I know it. I can go back to it whenever I want. I can recall it. I remember it vividly, moment for moment. August 19th, 2004. It's the worst day of my life. The good news is every day after that is a good day compared to that.
Why? What was that day?
So my friends aren't dying. We're not getting blown up with IEDs, these sorts of things. It can always be worse. We're not being shot at with rockets, with whatever. I can count on, and so that was one of those, after the deployment, that was a pivotal moment when I sort of decided that I've had the worst day of my life, right? When or where is irrelevant, but the fact that I've had it was the point that I was sort of convincing myself.
Right.
Now, another one of those came when, and there was a portion of that deployment where we were getting mortared and rocketed daily. Like you could set your watch by it, and this was in Anbar province outside of Fallujah, right? So those guys that was a rough year, all right? And it was around 10 a.m., I want to say every day for like weeks, we would just get hit. And I was outside of this shelter one day walking around, and my section leader happened to be walking with me, and we received that incoming fire, right? And of course we did what we naturally would want to do and take cover and sort of thing. But then these rounds started getting closer and closer and closer. And it was almost as if they were walking them into our position. And they were getting louder and louder, and the ground was shaking ever more violently. And I remember thinking that at this rate, at this progression, one of them's about to land on us. And that was the first time where I had come to the conclusion and accepted the fact that I was going to die. I didn't see it as somewhat of a defeat. It was almost like a sense of surprising euphoria, where this is it. That is a pivotal moment. That is a life-changing thing to experience. Not everybody can experience that sort of thing. It's so powerful in retrospect because you're just so ever more grateful for the days that you're alive. But coming to that sense of acceptance, not capitulation, but just acceptance. It's like, okay, I cannot do anything to prevent this. I've accepted it. I've lived a happy life. Brother, it was good knowing you.
Yep.
It was a very magical moment. And I don't perceive that as, of course it was a traumatic incident, but I don't perceive it as traumatic stress. I don't let it sort of affect me in the negative. That's one of those things that I look at as a great learn. I look at it as an experience rather than not something that happened to me, but very much something that happened for me, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Just to be a little bit more specific about that instance, how did you survive?
They stopped. That's it. It just stopped. I felt, it was very interesting. Call it a hedge of angels. I don't know what it was, but guys very near and dear and close to me were perishing, and I came out completely unscathed. Is that some type of divine intervention? I don't know. But I think the mission is very clear henceforth, and I don't disagree with there was perhaps a reason why they stopped, to get metaphysical on you.
Right. No, that's okay. That being said, I mean, if there have been days like that where you consider it to be, and now is that the day you consider to be the worst day of your life, or is that a different experience?
That was a different one. Yeah.
Okay.
So and then there was another one that actually this was back on the worst day. So it's interesting. You kind of take away different lessons, even though it all happened within an 8-hour period. You take away different lessons, and you remember different things very vividly. One of the things that after that convoy that patrol was hit, we did our immediate action drills was to punch out 360 degrees security and point rifles and weapons outboard and try to see if there's any waiting for a secondary attack, right? It might have been something worse than just a massive IED. And I started looking at, we were about 600 yards or so away from some houses, some folks' shelters. And there was an old fellow in his window, like sitting just watching us. Now, at the time, when I see a person and they're holding a phone, immediately I think they're getting ready to trigger another explosive. And so I had back then we had only recently been issued these nice high-speed optics that had a great magnification capability. So I drew a bead on this fellow, and my rifle safety selector went to fire, and I'm sitting there and I'm holding, literally holding in my hand, and this, I'm only describing this as how I perceived it well after the fact. In the moment, what I was waiting for him to do was to start pushing buttons, in which case I was going to smoke him. But what I came to realize what that was possessing the power of death over life, if that makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
And experiencing those different emotions on those different times are very, very magical and pivotal moments. It's very difficult to describe. I can tell the tale, but it's difficult to articulate the feelings that are associated with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's heavy. There's something I want to ask you about, because you've even expressed to me there's been some times when you've had some pretty rough goes since. Were these experiences and remembering the quote-unquote worst days of your life, did they help you in other bad times?
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. Yeah, so you develop a bit of a conditioning to it, certainly. Strangely enough, toward the end of that deployment, when in the beginning it was terrifying, toward the end when we were shot at, you don't care anymore. It's almost as if you've accepted, number one, that it's going to happen, and you develop this sense of numbness. Like, there's literally nothing I can do about it, so why get all upset about it in that moment? Why not just kind of let it happen? So there was that moment of just kind of like a numb, whatever happens. I don't care.
But you obviously still have to, I would imagine you took cover.
Oh, sure.
It's not you're just standing like, hit me,
Well, no,
and
like, actually, quite the contrary. There were a couple of times where we would just stand there.
Huh.
Yeah, this happened. It was funny, too, because in that particular, there was a high troop turnover, so there were a lot of new guys all the time. There were the salty dogs leaving and a bunch of the new faces coming in, and you can always tell who the new faces in town because they're the ones that are freaking out and running for cover and all these sorts of things. I want to say it's probably damaging psychologically, but in many ways it's also quite relieving.
But didn't you care if you got hit?
I did. Yeah, of course I cared. I think it was just I'd reached a certain level of numbness. I don't know how else to describe it than just being numb.
When you were in this situation, prior to this, I'm assuming that you've had a degree of tactical training that you view your surroundings, you see where your exits are, you see where the fire is coming from. Were these two things at odds with each other? Your sense of numbness and your sense of training? Were these two things kind of fighting for positions for the forefront of your brain, or were they both happening in parallel?
I think they very much happened in parallel. Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question, because you still act. It's not as if I was Weekend at Bernie's. I wasn't doing nothing, but I wasn't particularly scared, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Right, and I guess how was your perception of time affected while this stuff was happening? Because generally when you're experiencing combat, I understand that
it stands still.
It either slows down or it's just happening at some rapid rate. What was that like for you?
8-hour incidents seem like only a couple of hours. It just slows. It or I guess in that sense speeds. I don't know. I'm kind of lost track. But yeah, time seemingly stands still. And what's interesting is this: you can watch post-shooting interviews with a lot of police officers who will describe the incident as they saw it, and then they'll go back and review the vehicle dash cam footage, and it tells a completely different story. Not because that officer was trying to be deceitful, but because he literally had no recollection of time, at least in the aftermath, and being able to share it. It's fascinating, actually, how the mind works.
So that brings up something that I've wanted to mention on this podcast, and it may be a good way for us to sort of start to wrap up, because I think, and of course, if there's anything else you want to dig into, by all means, but you and I were talking about anxiety, I don't know, a while ago, months ago. It was a long time ago, actually, maybe even a year. We were on the phone and we were discussing that I was dealing with some level of anxiety at the time, and I was really interested in toughening up, coming to see you and coming down here for some training and so forth, which still, like, I haven't done. And Jake and I have been actually talking about that. We haven't been able to.
We talk about you a lot.
Yeah, we haven't had a chance to do it. And it is still something I'm interested in, and maybe that is one of my hobbies that I need to explore. But we were talking about fear. We were talking about anxiety. And I was saying that I was afraid of what I don't even remember at this point what I was feeling, or what I was anxious about. But do you remember what you told me? Do you remember this, like, the scenario you described when trying to express the difference between, like, being, like, experiencing real fear? Right.
Yeah. So you were talking about. Actually, I think you were talking about being afraid of some things, something like this, and I made the clear distinction between fear, the actual what is called a signal in the presence of danger, versus worry or anxiety or doubt, or sort of these sorts of things that a lot of people assume is fear, right? A lot of people say, well, I'm scared of this job interview or whatever, it is they have to endure, when in actuality that's just stress. That's just an anxiety. That's not actually. The example I used, I believe, was imagine I call you up on the phone in the evening and I say, hey, Matt, in about an hour I'm going to come to your house, jump through your window and stab you in the throat, and then I hang up the phone. And then it begs the question, would you be scared? Well, a lot of folks point to you, well, yeah, I'd be scared, I'd be terrified. Well, actually, no, you would be worried. Now, fast forward an hour, and here I come actually flying through the window, going after your neck with a knife. Now you're scared. Now you're experiencing a signal in the presence of danger, in which case your, hopefully, autonomic nervous system responses will protect you. The startle reflex, as they call it. It's interesting if you've watched YouTube and you can watch scare cam reels. You ever watch these, like the compilations of scare cam?
Sure.
They're a riot. But what's interesting is that when people get scared, where do their hands go? Up, right here, right in front of their face, in front of their neck, in front of their vitals. This is an autonomic nervous system response. We've survived as a species because of startle reflex. Isn't it interesting?
It is.
It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
So fear in that regard, though, and then this is also a part of my lecture, fear is a tool. It's not necessarily a bad word. And a lot of people they seem to have a poor, or rather negative relationship with fear. And it also kind of ties into that alpha inhibitor thing, like I'm not scared of anything. Fear is actually a gift. There's a fantastic book in our realm called The Gift of Fear by a fellow named Gavin DeBecker. He started a great security firm, modestly named Gavin DeBecker and Associates. But it's called The Gift of Fear. It's all about actually using this thing to your advantage, and how it's the reason why we've survived as long as we have. Like, fear is actually a good thing, and to deny it and to pretend it doesn't exist is foolish.
Right.
Going into those, if I may, talking about the relationship that people have with fear, in terms of the treatment of post-traumatic stressors, right, or incidents, as they were. Another way I describe this to guys is I describe it as two types of partnerships. There's a dynamic, right? So there's two types of partnerships or relationships you can have. It's very simple. It doesn't matter what it is. If you look at your dining table in your house, there's an empowering partnership between the table surface and the legs. Without the legs, the table would fall, right? It's a stupid example, but it's a fact. Every single thing that exists in one of two forms. It's either adversarial or empowering, right? And so when guys receive or they experience an incident and they look at it as a trauma, and they're told that they have post-traumatic stress disorder, what they're actively, unknowingly, they're cultivating an adversarial relationship with trauma and with themselves. The story, again, goes back to the stories that they're telling themselves. That's an adversarial relationship. Whereas changing the language and changing the perception to post-traumatic growth is actually an empowering relationship. And those relationships exist between absolutely everything that is, physiological, technological, or otherwise. They exist in two forms. It's actually, when you kind of step back and look at it, it's very easy to see if any circumstance is empowering or adversarial. That can be business partnerships, that can be marital relationships, with your spouse, that can be the relationship with your kids, it can be relationships with your coworkers, whatever it is. A lot of these alpha guys they obviously don't understand this, and they live in this world of adversarial relationships. They assume that when they go out on the street and they deal with Joe Citizen, who may or may not have a warrant for arrest or something like this, they treat every single person adversarially. I say they, a lot of them do, not all of them at all. But then inversely, the civilian perceives that officer, guess what, as an adversary. They've pulled me over, they've inconvenienced me, they've stopped me from going to pick up the kids from whatever. They've now made my day bad. They're an adversary, which is awful.
Yeah. It'd be nice to change that perception, and I think that's what you're essentially trying to do from inside out.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so you have, the way I describe it is, you have your relationship with anyone else, that's one, and then there's your relationship with yourself. So you can develop great empowering relationships with family, coworkers, or everyone else, but if your internal relationship with yourself is suffering, your structure will collapse. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's what we were discussing earlier, even at dinner, is the rings of perception, right? And you have this perception of yourself, you have this perception of what the people closest to you think, and then you have the perception of what you think the people closest to you think. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So there's the out, the in, and then what you think the in is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I hope that, this is something that I work on, that currently I'm struggling with decisions that I'm making for myself and for my friends and for my family and for the band and so forth. There's a lot going on personally that I'm thinking about. And without going into too much detail, I guess my hope is that, when you talk about fear and when you talk about worry and the big difference between worry and fear and just simply being scared or anxious about something and actually having a threat, I hope that people can really start deciphering the difference between those two things.
Yeah. It would be life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be. And we've talked a lot about anxiety on this podcast. We get a lot of questions about how to deal with certain subjects and certain topics and certain things like that. And it's amazing, and I'm honored to have had you on this podcast, because I think you've been through a lot of things that the majority of people that I know personally have not been through, and you've come out on top. And I think the lessons that you can teach of being in the face of true fear and true danger should trickle down to the daily decisions that people make, even as far as getting out of their comfort zone. If someone is afraid to, communicate or put themselves out there, there's a lot of people out there that, let's just, as an example, talk about business or networking, right? Networking is such a term that I think a lot of people are scared of, because either it's douchey, they're going to be perceived as a douche, or they're selling something, or they're simply just not comfortable communicating and getting out of their shell. They're more introverted, right?
Yeah.
And there's this big fear to get out there and put yourself out there. But if you really think about it, what is the worst thing that's going to happen if, when you go to get a coffee, you say to the barista, "How's your day?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or the person that you really want to meet from a networking perspective, you put yourself out there and say, hey, I really respect what you do. How are you? What are you working on? I've done some research on you. I think this is great. Like, so many people are afraid. They have fear of those situations, when in reality,
it's just anxiety.
It's just anxiety, and there are coping mechanisms out there, and I think the best coping mechanism is to force yourself into those situations, right?
Well, I also think there's an ambiguity to just the term networking, that people they're supposed to like go out and talk to people because it'll benefit them. Really what I think networking is, at least to me, and what I've found to benefit me, is you're not just like networking to benefit yourself. If you really want to network and really understand what I think the term means, is you go out there and you get to know the people that you're talking to. You don't just network because it's going to net you something. You network because a network is a strong bond of people, and you're not going to continue that strong bond of people if you're not going and thinking about what they need and what they want and what they want to talk about, and you have to, it goes both ways. It's not just like you're taking something through networking. So I think because of that ambiguity, people are terrified. Nobody really gets a clear explanation of what networking is. So I think that's where the fear comes from.
I think a less douchey, as it were, way to describe it, the words I use, because language is everything, right? The words I use are partnership management. When people, because I get invited, folks like, hey, this will be a great networking opportunity. So I immediately delete that word because I just don't like it. It's become such a bad word that I say, oh, great, this is an excellent opportunity to cultivate partnerships,
right?
To cultivate relationships. And as Jake said, if why you're doing what you're doing is, let's call it pure or sound, and you'd find, I think you're more likely to find that the rewards will be greater, right? And it comes from obviously being selfless and having a clear and defined mission, especially if you're keen to help other people. It's people helping people. It's powerful stuff.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, and I think it's a great spot to wrap this. I think what you're doing to help people that are in need is amazing, and I think through your experience, you're going to succeed. I think it's going to be a long road, and it's going to take time, but you've convinced me, and I really am happy that you're doing what you're doing, because I know it is pure and it will help a lot of people. And I'm honestly very happy that you were willing to be on this podcast to discuss these topics, because it is just another platform. It's one platform of many out there, but it will reach people, and it will educate them, and therefore help them, and potentially help them help others. And that is 1000% been the goal of this podcast and what we're trying to do. And it really is, I think, out of everybody in this band, even, like, that's our goal, is to help other people through entertainment, right? And through help each other by bonding and communicating. I mean, Jake, you and I had a talk this morning where we were communicating very honestly, and I'm telling you things that are going on in my life, and it's really hard to do that sometimes, but it's extremely helpful. So that network and that brotherhood and sisterhood that we can be a part of is truly important. So if you're listening to this and you took something away, or if there is one thing to take away, it's no matter what you've been through, no matter how crazy of a situation, how scary of a situation you're in, I think you got to use every bit of experience to help educate others for the greater good, right?
Yeah, amen. And in fact, if anyone's listening that fits that category and doesn't know where to go, contact me. We'll talk about it.
So as we wrap, Brandon, we have a Facebook group, which you probably heard me talk about before in the other episodes of the podcast. And for those listening, if you're not familiar, our group is you can find it at facebook.com/groups/chocolate croissants. It'd be great, Brandon, if you haven't yet, if you can join the group.
I will, because
I think there'll be a lot of questions for you, and we'll absolutely make a post about it. But what I love about the group is it is exactly what I just described, as people helping people, sharing their stories, sharing their concerns, sharing their questions. And there's a real sense of community there, of people that are just trying to do good by others, So if you're listening and you haven't joined yet, check it out. Again, facebook.com/group/chocolate croissants. If you do have questions for Brandon, you can definitely submit them. Again, we'll start a thread, and Brandon can share as much of his contact information as he'd like. As we close this, I just want to thank everybody for listening. As always, we really appreciate your feedback. So whether it's in the group or whether it's in iTunes by way of a review or a rating, we really appreciate it. It helps us to know what we can do better, and it helps us to spread the word and help out as many people as possible. And we'll be back shortly with episode 34 soon. I'm pretty sure our next guest is going to be, I think, Javier Reyes from Animals as Leaders, which will be a whole different story and a whole different vibe from today, but a great vibe nonetheless. So for those of you who've stuck with us this whole time, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your attention as always. Jake, thanks for being here. Yeah. Thank you for contributing. Brandon, obviously, thank you for preparing for this and thinking about this and being willing to share. And on behalf,
it's been an honor.
Good, thank you. It's been an honor to hear your story. And on behalf of myself, Jordan, and Justin, who could not be here because they're not with us on tour right now, I just want to say we appreciate you. And in the words of Jordan, bye-bye.